I want to thank everyone for being here in person and online, and to really welcome my dear, dear friend, Rachel Gordan, who is esteemed professor of Jewish studies at the University of Florida. Most importantly tonight, author of the amazing, you all need to go buy it and read it right now if you haven't already, Postwar Stories, How Books Made Judaism American. And most importantly to me, my dear, dear friend who I met long ago when we were 17 on a summer trip to Israel. So I'm really, really delighted to be celebrating this book with you this evening, and to really talk about this real achievement of yours in capturing this moment in American Jewish history that, as I'm reading, I'm sort of like thinking, oh my God, this is where our American Jewish world came from. Like, this is like what built the world that we are living in now. And so I'm curious for you to share with us, like, for you, where did this book come from?
Well, it came from writing a dissertation about post-World War II American Judaism. Can't hear me. How about, maybe I need to hold this closer. How is that?
I don't think you need to hold it. I think it's just
oh.
I think, in other words, I think it's fine.
Okay, how is it sounding? Pretty good, okay. So it came from writing a dissertation on post-World War II American Judaism, which was originally called How Judaism Became an American Religion. And I knew I was attracted to the 1950s era, that I was interested in this period of American Jewish history, and I wasn't exactly sure what the question was I wanted to explore. So I did something that a lot of grad students do. I did a search in the New York Times of Jews and Judaism between 1920 and 1970, because I knew this mid-20th century was the era I was curious about. And I was looking for what change do I see when I'm reading all of these articles between the 20s through the 70s? And a major change I noticed was this switch from talking about Jews as members of a persecuted, alienated, subhuman, marginalized race or people or problem to an emphasis on Jews as members of a religion in the immediate post-World War II period. So that was really interesting to me. And the question is, how and why does this change happen? And after writing the dissertation, I realized that one of the strands that emerged from the story I was telling was that middlebrow culture played a big role in this period and this change.
And what do you mean by middlebrow?
It's not a term we use a ton, although it's still around. These brow categories emerged in the beginning of the 20th century, started with highbrow in the first decade of the 20th century, and then it spawned the other categories, lowbrow and then middlebrow. They all come from phrenology, which was this pseudoscience around the idea that skull size had something to do with your mental capability. And in the mid-20th century, in the late 40s especially, middlebrow emerged again as a popular category. In 1949, Harper's Magazine published a chart that listed lowbrow, lower middlebrow, upper middlebrow, and highbrow, and it listed all of these categories for things like dress, furniture, causes, and it was kind of half jokingly, but that's something about all of the brow categories, is that they're always sort of joking, but kind of serious, and you still see it today. The magazine, New York Magazine, actually every week, they have what they call the approval matrix, and it has lowbrow, highbrow, I think brilliant and despicable are the two sides. And it's sort of this kind of I'd say non-judgmental way of judging others.
Like it is judgmental, isn't it? Right.
You're allowed to call things middlebrow and highbrow, but it actually is always said with a kind of judgment. So it's never really a neutral category. And middlebrow especially seems to be the most judgmental one of all. People seem to own their highbrow or lowbrow kind of proudly. But middlebrow, for instance, in 1942, the Atlantic Monthly published a letter from Virginia Woolf where she says, "I am proudly highbrow," And I, have good feelings about the lowbrow folks too. It's the middlebrow I can't stand. They're always trying to curry favor. They're always supposedly sort of have something in common with the highbrow, they think, and they also can appreciate the lowbrow. But she ends the letter by saying, if anyone calls me a middlebrow, then I will stab them to death with a pencil, is what she says. So it's sort of assumed to be, it's not a cultural standing that people usually embrace. But I'm using it here with the meanings that most scholars agree that middlebrow has. So there's a bunch of traits that people connect with it. Middlebrow is usually aspirational. If I am a middlebrow consumer, I am sort of trying to improve myself. And that's why something like Oprah's book club was a good example. It's also considered mediated culture. So like Oprah's book club or some of these other book clubs, somebody else has chosen for me what I should be reading, what will help improve my tastes. It's also usually considered feminine and more commercial. And things change over time. There are
Can I ask you, feminine based on the people writing it or the people reading it? Or the people, no, I guess it's not just reading and writing if it's not just books, but is it the creators of it or the receivers of it?
It's usually the people who are receiving it. Okay. So men can create middlebrow culture that the assumed reader is female, and also something about the space. So middlebrow literature is often assumed to be consumed at home. The domestic space is considered more feminine.
As opposed to studying it at a university or something.
Yeah, I mean, I don't quite agree with this. There's this thought that highbrow is something that is read at a desk and middlebrow is read while reclining. But I think there's, highbrow stuff could be read reclining too. There are things that change over time, or that...
Like what we would call a beach book.
A beach book, right. Yes. So that would be a reclining kind of lowbrow. But there are things like The New Yorker that are often up for debate. It's generally assumed that The New Yorker is pretty middlebrow, because by now it's very accessible, and many of us who read it have a little bit of a look at me, I'm reading The New Yorker sort of feeling about, it being sort of aspirational culture. Probably in its beginning years, it might have been more categorized as highbrow. Yeah, put it down here, so let's see if...
Yeah.
Oh, yes.
Yeah, this is just coming from your collar.
Okay, all right, so this works.
Yes, as long as you record that, you're good. Perfect.
Good. Great. So what I'm in the book, part of what I'm saying about the mid-20th century then is that it was this, I label it the mid-century moment in Jewish middlebrow culture, that we have this real concentration of middlebrow culture, of middlebrow Jewish culture. Not that there hadn't been before, but there's more of it in this late 40s and 50s era. And actually a lot of it is doing the work of explaining Judaism as an American religion, which we don't see as much before this late 40s era. So I'm thinking of a movie like Marjorie Morningstar from the late 50s, for instance. The best-selling novel came out in 1955 by Herman Wouk, and then it's turned into a movie starring Natalie Wood and Gene Kelly. Early in this movie, there is a scene of Marjorie Morningstar's younger brother being bar mitzvahed. I think this is the first portrayal of a middle-class synagogue scene, or at least of a bar mitzvah. If you compare it to a movie from a generation earlier, The Jazz Singer, from 1927.
Yeah, that's what I was going to ask.
Yeah, and that you probably remember as a really immigrant, ethnic
I was going to say, it's an old world, right? The whole point is that it's very alien. It's nothing is in English, right?
Exactly. In Marjorie Morningstar, I mean, anyone who's been in a synagogue and heard someone chanting Torah or Haftorah it will sound familiar because you hear the boy chanting Torah, but it's very middle class. Natalie Wood is the Jewish sister. She's kind of flirting with the person she's been going out with, who is played by also a non-Jewish actor. So they were not trying to get ethnic-looking actors for this 50s film. So that's an example, but other examples from this middlebrow this mid-century moment in Jewish middlebrow culture, I think many would come to mind for us. Things like the All of a Kind family series, which came out in the 1950s. These children's books by Sidney Taylor, in which actually here too the author does portray Jewish holidays in a kind of respectable American way. Actually, one thing that always rubbed me wrong about this series is the illustrations. I guess this might be a positive thing, but they really don't look like Jews. They look very scrubbed clean of any sort of
like Natalie Wood.
Right, like Natalie Wood playing Marjorie Morningstar. So All of a Kind Family is another example. The Diary of Anne Frank, and especially as Broadway play and then film in the 50s.
With also a non-Jewish actor, right? Mildred Perkins.
Right. Yeah. And Exodus, of course, at the end of the 50s. So there's several of these examples, and in the book, I'm focused on two genres that had not been identified before. But one is called the anti-Semitism novels of the 1940s, and the other is the introduction to Judaism books of the late 40s and 50s.
I feel like we're still living with a lot of these genres and their impact on the previous generation. So I want to go to those, but I think it's important to set the scene. If you could tell people a little bit about what American Jewish life was like or culture was like before that.
Yeah.
Because, I think that, what you talked before about the transition to a religion, to talking about Judaism as a religion and sort of finding a way to create that space for this to be part of like this, middlebrow American culture. Well, I want you to sort of talk about like what it looked like before that, but I know that I'd also like you to read part of your book because I want to make clear like this. Yes, this is an academic book, very very prestigious Oxford University Press, but this is a very readable book that could have easily been a book from any trade publication, and so I want you to just read part of it so we have a sense of your voice.
Okay, great. So this is a little bit where I'm explaining. I do talk about the mid-20th century as a religion moment in the 20th century. When I'm teaching American Jewish history or about the American Jewish experience, I'm often describing how over the course of the 20th century, the meaning of Jewishness changes. So in the beginning of the 20th century, we're in a kind of race era where to be a Jew is to be a member of this Jewish race or Semitic group or Hebrew people, and then we go toward the mid-20th century, which is when Postwar Stories is mostly focused, and we're in the religion moment. And then by the end of the 20th century, I think we're moving towards a culture moment, which doesn't mean that there's no religion in the beginning of the 20th century or at the end, there's no culture at other points, but these are sort of points of emphasis, I notice. So in describing religion's mid-century moment, I say, several events indicated that the mid-20th century was a time of greater salience for religion in American public life. It was in the 1950s that the phrase, "under God," was added to the Pledge of Allegiance. "In God We Trust" became the national motto, while the idea of Judeo-Christianity as the antidote to totalitarian regimes gained widespread currency in the 1940s and 1950s. Judaism in popular culture played a surprisingly central role in the cultural shifts that made religion prominent after nearly 2 decades of what felt like years of spiritual depression, in addition to economic depression to many in the Northeast, where much post-war Jewish literature was created. Indeed, Gentleman's Agreement and Joshua Liebman's Peace of Mind, and these are 2 books I mentioned earlier in Postwar Stories, were stars in a constellation of mid-century Jewish popular culture that, taken together, both drove and reflected a recasting of American Judaism. While the aftermath of this mid-century transformation has been explored in scholarly investigations of the Judeo-Christian tradition, there has been far less attention to the way popular culture participated in this change. Historians focusing on post-war American Jews have yet to fully answer the question of how Judaism achieved its post-war status as an American religion. This question is one that already intrigued post-war observers. In the mid-1950s, the sociologist Nathan Glazer mused, quote, "It would be an interesting essay in the history of ideas to determine just how the United States evolved in the popular mind from a Christian nation to a nation made up of Catholics, Protestants, and Jews. The most interesting part of such a study, which I do not plan to undertake here, would be to discover how it came about that the Jewish group, which through most of the history of the United States has formed an insignificant percentage of the American people, has come to be granted the status of, quote, most favored religion. The tectonic shift that Glaser observed is at the heart of Postwar Stories, which argues that authors of popular culture participated in the transformation in the status of American Judaism. As part of an efflorescence of post-war Jewish culture, these writers offer Jews new ways of understanding their identities while also reaching broader American audiences who, in accordance with their pro-democracy and anti-fascist worldview, embrace the post-war American decorum of eschewing anti-Semitism. Even as Americans rose to the theme of anti-Semitism, they knew very little about Jews and their religion. In response to this ignorance about Jewishness, writers sought to educate Americans and by simultaneously reminding them of the deeply un-American nature of anti-Semitism and instructing them in the key attributes of Judaism as a religion. Acceptance of Jews as members of an American religion involved some level of rejection of the notion that Jews composed a distinct and inferior race, inherently worthy of marginalization. I'll stop there, but the quotation from Glaser that I mentioned, where Glaser is saying, how did it come to be that Judaism has this most favored religion status, is an interesting one for us to think of in our own moment. But it does reflect this awe that so many scholars and observers of Jews felt by the late 50s of, how did we get to this wonderful position of Jews and Judaism? You can hear the sense of American Jewish exceptionalism in Glaser's voice there. This sort of only in America, maybe a dozen years after the Holocaust, are we in this position where Judaism is considered one of the, quote, big three religions. And I do, as Dara was saying, I spend some time in the beginning of the book talking about the before to my mid-century moment as a way to show you how much change was happening. So in the decades before this late 40s moments, in the 20s and 30s, as we know, it's a time of probably the most serious, the worst anti-Semitism in the 20th century, and really, I think even before that. Dara and I, over dinner before, were just talking about how cyclical anti-Semitism is in American history, and around the turn of the 20th century, from the 19th to the 20th century, in the first years of the 20th century, it did not look as bad as things would then seem by the 20s and 30s. There weren't as many Jews in the U.S. The period of great migration had not fully happened or ended by that point. The nativism of the 20s made things so much worse. The revival of the KKK in the 20s, which unlike its earlier eras, but when it is revived in the 30s, in the 20s, that is its third period. And this time it is even more insidious because it is very middle class in membership, and it's not just in the South. And it's anti-Catholic, and it's anti-Black, and it's anti-Jewish, and many candidates for state and local elections are members of the KKK. It has the veneer of something that looks respectable because there's a lot of civic engagement. The KKK runs charity drives and raises money for Protestant hospitals. So it's seemingly sort of innocuous, but there's a lot of violence too. So there's that. There's Father Coughlin on the radio through the 1930s. Yeah. Henry Ford's Dearborn Independent. I mention all these things just to remind us that for a Jew who's an adult in the 40s who has grown up with the 20s and 30s anti-Semitism, there's a real contrast they're noting in the post-war period.
And there's something that actually you brought up. It may be in this book or it may be in something else that you've published, but I remember at one point, and you were the one who taught this to me, that we today talk about anti-Semitic incidents. And, at that period, like, it's not about incidents, it's about, like, your entire life, right? I mean, to the point where it's so normal that it's like even Jews almost don't even have a language for talking about it, or don't even bother to talk about it. And I'm wondering if you could tell us a little bit about, how Jews at that time experienced that life and how they regarded their Jewish identity as American Jews. Because there's some really interesting stuff in the book about people like Harry Wolfson, who was the first Jewish professor at Harvard. Not the first, because there was somebody in the colonial period or something, but one of the first modern Jewish professors at Harvard, and just it's really striking the difference in the way that generation talks about American Jewish identity.
Yeah. So I mean, this difference between I mentioned how we do talk about isolated incidents today. So often, students or community members ask, what is the difference between anti-Semitism today or in the 20s or 30s and early 40s? And we are, I think it's a good thing that we're outraged when the Tree of Life shooting in Pittsburgh in 2018, any of these other horrible incidents that have happened in the past 7 years especially. But I guess part of what I'm describing in the 20s and 30s is this feeling of ambient anti-Semitism, is how I describe it here, as really part of the air that someone breathes, that it is not just accepted but expected, really, so that, I think I quoted in here, possibly even Deborah Lipstadt at some point is sort of reflecting how even when she was thinking about colleges to apply for, and this is even later, I think it's probably in the early 60s, she was just talking about that process of realizing all the Jews knew there was just colleges you probably weren't going to get into, this feeling of a glass ceiling, Jews just knowing this club is unlikely to accept me. I'm not likely to be able to buy a house in this fashionable neighborhood. These elite universities or graduate schools don't take many Jews. So many things were off limits. And I talk about, in order to highlight that experience of kind of acceptance and resignation and kind of the communal depression that was involved there, and just sort of accepting this bleak state of affairs, or at least kind of a real limit on dreams and aspirations for young people. I talk about Harry Wolfson, who was a professor at Harvard in the early 20th century, in the teens and 20s. And he wrote a pamphlet that was directed at college students, and it was called Escaping Judaism. And he has a phrase in there where he says, this is really jarring the first time I read it, some men are born blind, some deaf, and some Jews. And it's his way of expressing that this is experienced as a handicap, as a liability, as a kind of burden and tragedy for many young people. And I, in the book, sort of trace many of the places that I find this discourse of Jewishness as disability, as handicap, as a burden, and how, part of what is happening in post-war stories is moving from that understanding of Jewishness as tragedy, unfortunate, birth defect, or however you want to say it, towards moving to Jewishness as a source of pride. And, the same facts, being born Jewish or gay or black or whatever it is, in certain circumstances might be described with this kind of discourse of tragedy, but there's the possibility of moving towards an attitude of pride, and I think that is something we see after this mid-century moment that I'm describing, is that Jews are moving towards pride and away from the idea of it as a burden.
And what I think your book captures really beautifully is that it doesn't happen by itself, right? And it doesn't happen from the outside, right? This happens very much like through the active work of, American Jewish culture producers of many kinds. And so, I want to go to the sort of first category that you tackle in the book of this, which, maybe exists a little bit prior to this period, but really blossoms in this period, which is what you call anti-Semitism literature.
Yeah.
And, the most famous example example of it is this writer Laura Hobson and her book Gentleman's Agreement, and which of course became an Oscar-winning film. So, can you tell us a little bit about that work, about that genre, and specifically about Laura Hobson, because she's just kind of a fascinating, amazing character. I mean, she's a real person.
Right.
In addition to the character she creates.
So fascinating that I'm working on a biography of her now. She's a real 20th century life. She's born in 1900 to parents who are Yiddishists. Her father helps to found the Jewish Daily Forward. Her mother writes a women's column for Der Tog, another Yiddish paper. And the family moves to Jamaica, Queens, so that she and her twin sister can have what her parents consider a more American upbringing. She starts at Hunter College, and she has this feeling that she wants a more American college experience with a campus and sororities and all of those extracurriculars. So she transfers to Cornell and is a very active, involved writer and in theater and in sports at Cornell, and graduates in 1921, the same year as the writer E.B. White also graduated from Cornell. And it's at Cornell that she experiences some of her first anti-Semitic experiences. Again, interesting now considering what students are experiencing in college campuses, but she does not get into Phi Beta Kappa, and one of the Jewish professors at Cornell tells her this is because of anti-Semitism. And she does not get into the sorority she wants to get into, and it's pretty clear it's because she's Jewish. So she takes experiences like that with her, and then goes on to work in advertising and as a reporter. And I should say she's really not very Jewishly affiliated. This is part of what makes her interesting, because she's someone who no one expected, and I think she also never expected she would write what would be considered an important Jewish book. And she is involved in writing and publishing. She's working at Time magazine for many years, is actually pretty close with publisher Henry Luce and his wife Claire Booth Luce. And also Richard Simon of Simon & Schuster becomes a good friend. He encourages her to write a novel. He thinks she has that in her. She writes one novel in 1943. It's actually about refugees from Europe. But in a very typical Laura Z. Hobson fashion, it is about non-Jewish refugees, even though for most people, refugee almost had a connotation of Jewishness in the early 40s. But in also what's happening at this time, and what sort of I cite as one of the moments that crystallized this culture of anti-Semitism, is she hears the speech by Charles Lindbergh on September 11th, 1941, when Lindbergh is at an America First rally in Des Moines. And many of us know this speech from the Philip Roth Plot Against America novel and HBO show, where Lindbergh does in fact blame three groups for trying to push America into the war. And one of those groups is the Jews. And Laura Z. Hobson is pregnant at this point. Just to give you a little more of her biography, she had been married in the early 30s to the non-Jewish publisher Thayer Hobson. They are divorced when she is 35, in 1935. They had not been able to have children, although they wanted to. She decides to go ahead and adopt on her own. So she adopts a child from an adoption agency that's still around in Evanston, Illinois, called The Cradle, that really caters to celebrities and wealthy folks, which at this point, she's actually earning a really nice living, and they realize this woman can afford nannies and private schools, and she'd make a great mother. So she has adopted her own first child in 1937, and she is dating and continuing to have a busy social life and career life in Manhattan. And at 41, she finds herself pregnant and decides she wants to have this child on her own.
So a very unconventional person for this time period.
And kind of ahead of her time in many ways. So in the summer and fall of 1941, she has rented a home in Connecticut when she is pregnant, and hearing this speech by Lindbergh on the radio, and is outraged and feeling really kind of alone, because she actually is alone in her pregnancy there. And she's wondering, what can I do? And she writes an essay, and it's called Choice ... for Gentiles. And the message there is, it's up to you, Gentile America, if you want to do something about this kind of anti-Semitism that is festering. We Jews are a tiny minority. And part of what is germinating for her is her idea that it's the majority culture that's going to have to solve this problem of anti-Semitism. I mean, we Jews can do what we can, and we can write best-selling novels like she does that are exposing and attacking anti-Semitism, but the majority of Americans have to kind of sign on that this is something that deserves attention. So that is one of the moments. And another thing I like about this term anti-Semitism, which we do see in the 40s, it sounds so clunky to us today, but it really captures the change that is happening. It is not that Americans are suddenly loving Jews. We know intermarriage rates are still actually quite low then, but Americans are changing their attitudes about anti-Semitism with Hitler in Europe. It sort of becomes less acceptable to be resembling the Nazis. And if they, the Europeans, hate Jews, well, then part of what it's going to mean to be a good liberal American is that we oppose anti-Semitism, and slowly we will even start to change how we regard Jews and their religion. So Hobson starts to have this idea for writing a novel attacking anti-Semitism, and she sends a proposal of this novel idea to her publisher, Richard Simon, who's an assimilated Jew, and he's really skeptical. He writes back to her and says that he does not think writing a novel will do anything, and it might even make things worse. And she sends this proposal to actually a bunch of friends, and she is somewhat encouraged to find that actually many of her non-Jewish friends are a little more encouraging. So she moves forward with it, and part of what proved so encouraging and helpful to her is finding out that there are other people, actually other women writers, who are writing anti-Semitism novels. And so in the book, I do talk about some of these other examples that Hobson hears about in the 40s, and they're encouraging to her because she realizes there is a market, and maybe if a few of us are writing these popular novels, the word will sort of get out there in this very middlebrow way of women reading popular novels and talking to their friends and their husbands about them, and they will sort of literally change the conversation around Jews and anti-Semitism.
And that's in a lot of ways what happens, right? Because then, gentleman's agreement, which probably a lot of you are familiar with from, if not from the novel, then from this, film with Gregory Peck, is, riding his high horse to, teach Americans how not to be bigots. The premise, for anyone who's not familiar, is this, this non-Jewish journalist who basically goes undercover as a Jew, to see if, it changes the way people treat him. Spoiler, it changes how people treat him. This sort of, because she takes on this non-Jewish character, and it's sort of framed as this, being anti-Semitic as being anti-American, she sort of cracks this formula of how to sort of get non-Jewish readers and moviegoers on board with this, and it's sort of this amazing moment. And but what's interesting, I think, in your work is that you take this, that story a step further, which is, you then, what that sort of, not just that book, but as you said, and that's one of the great things here too, is you unearth these other books that aren't as well remembered as hers are, as that book is, and you see how that actually created, in a lot of ways, and along with other historical circumstances, it created an appetite among the American public for curiosity about actually the content of Jewish culture, which leads to what you call this introduction to Judaism genre that really blossoms then. And I'm wondering if you could sort of tell us about those books that followed that moment, or followed that anti-Semitism moment, that were introducing readers to Judaism. Who wrote them, who was reading them, who were they for, and what was the role of those kinds of books? Yeah,
so the Intro to Judaism in some ways really comes as a response to the anti-Semitism. I mean, sometimes literally, so one of the, or actually a couple of the authors of Introduction to Judaism literature were rabbis who had read Gentleman's Agreement and given sermons about it, as many rabbis did in the late 40s, because it was this bestseller, because it was an Academy Award-winning film starring Gregory Peck. It was such a big deal cultural phenomenon that it was one of those things that rabbis too, couldn't help but pay attention to. And some of their sermons sort of had the theme of, all right, it's wonderful that there's this popular novel drawing attention to the problem of anti-Semitism, but there was a real missed opportunity here to show more of the positives of Judaism. And in fact, that is something very striking about Gentleman's Agreement. I'll mention is that, critics of it notice that you finish this novel or the film knowing no more about Judaism than when you started. Yeah. And I guess I would say in Hobson's defense is that was sort of true to the kind of Jew she was. She grew up in a secular home. I was able to speak with both of her sons, and I said, my guess is that Hobson never attended a Shabbat dinner or a Passover Seder. And they were like, yeah, they both said they did not think she had ever done those things. So it's not like she was denying who she was. She was this kind of secular Jew.
But even though it was in this moment, as you said, where there's this interest in the broader culture outside of Jewish circles in religion.
Yeah.
Right? This is a moment we're fighting off the godless Soviets, right? There's this sort of interest in religion in the broader culture too.
Yeah. What is interesting about that is Hobson does write into her novel this religion moment. So one of the most famous scenes from Gentleman's Agreement, which so many of my colleagues in Jewish studies and American history courses use, is the breakfast table scene when Gregory Peck has just been assigned this article to write about anti-Semitism. He's sitting at the breakfast table with his mother and his son, and he's telling his mother about the assignment. He's not so excited about it at this point. Remember, he's not Jewish, and he doesn't have a real interest or feeling about anti-Semitism. But his son asks him, what is anti-Semitism, and what are Jews anyway? And Phil's explanation,
the character,
played by Gregory Peck, says, remember the other day we walked by that church? Well, Jews have something called a synagogue. And the father, and Phil, this is the Phil Green character, does explain there are three ways to be an American. You can be a Catholic, a Protestant, or a Jew. And this is coming 8 years before Will Herberg publishes his classic study, Protestant Catholic Jew, which really has the same thesis, that there are now three ways to be an American Protestant Catholic Jew, and if you aren't one of those, Herberg says in that study, you don't really have a name in America. You don't really have an identity. When somebody asks you, what are you in 1950s America, the question they're asking is about what religion do you belong to?
So I'm just going to say we're going to pass around index cards for people who in the audience who might have questions. But in the meantime, can you just tell us about these Introduction to Judaism books? I mean, obviously there's a bunch of them, and they're all a little different from each other. But what was sort of the what was the kind of Judaism that these mostly rabbis were sharing with their readers of all faiths, or of all three faiths, as we would have said at that time?
Yeah. So these were primers on Judaism, and we see an evolution. And in the 40s, these Introduction to Judaism books, and the really popular one was Milton Steinberg of Park Avenue Synagogue here in Manhattan. He published one called Basic Judaism. And these titles really captured the expectation, the feeling.
Basic Judaism, right? You can't say you weren't warned, right?
Right. That it was perfectly American and acceptable to know next to nothing about Judaism and to need a book called Basic Judaism. Another is called What is a Jew by Morris Kurtzer. What the Jews Believe by Philip Bernstein, who was a Reform rabbi in Rochester and actually the cousin of Milton Steinberg, was another popular one that started as an article in Life magazine.
Life magazine being like perfect middlebrow thing you're reading, on your coffee table in your suburban home, right?
Yeah. And then Herman Wouk, who is Orthodox, publishes one in 1959. Called This Is My God, which, I think really was a popular bar mitzvah and confirmation gift for years after. So Wouk's is kind of at the end of my period. And by that point, the introduction to Judaism genre has really evolved from the how to what I call the why to. So that why to kind is really explaining why would you choose to be a Jew. It's really exploring the why question and not just giving you the facts of what it means to be to live a Jewish life. And I think that how to the why to is the one that is the kind that we still see a lot of today. So Sarah Hurwitz's book from 2019, Here All Along, is a contemporary version, and Noah Feldman's recent book that I think also just came out. These are explanations of Judaism that also include a lot of the person's kind of own personal experience, explaining why they have come back to or embraced or find this life meaningful.
Which is an interesting point, too, about, I don't know if we're still collecting questions, so an interesting point, too, about who was writing these books. And that was something that in your book becomes clear, is that it was sort of interesting to me how many of the people who wrote those books were what we might today within the Jewish community call a Bal Tshuva, right? People who sort of, maybe were raised more secular, but then sort of discovered Judaism in one way or another as adults, or came back to it as adults. Is there a reason why that seems to be often the person who was writing those kinds of books?
Yeah, there is definitely this theme of writers of Intro to Judaism having spent some period outside of a religious life and coming back to it or choosing it after having lived a pretty assimilated or secular upbringing. And I think that perspective they have on what it means to enter this, to have not been in it the whole time, is really helpful then for writing a good book that's going to appeal to people who are on the margins, or have not fully embraced Judaism.
And so here's a question: were these books for Jews to learn about Judaism, or were they for the broader public? And I mean, I guess, I don't know if it makes a difference in terms of the way they're framed. I mean, something like Life magazine, it seems like those were very much geared toward broad American public, but I'm curious about who was buying these books?
Yeah, it was definitely a mix, and the Life magazines, because there are two, there's a 1950 and then there's a 1955, the magazine really does get response, kind of equal response from both Jewish and non-Jewish readers. The Jewish readers, as you can imagine, are much more, I'd say, sort of self-conscious about how are we being portrayed, since everyone's aware that Life, just has a huge readership. So this is going to be, for many Americans, their only real view into who we are. But it did have the goal of both explaining. I sort of compare it to the way after 9/11 we saw a lot of what is Islam kind of books and media presentations after the Holocaust and World War II had shown a spotlight on Jews. Americans, non-Jewish Americans, were realizing, wait, who are these people that this horrible thing just happened to? And there was, as I mentioned, there was that whole process of Americans defining themselves in opposition to their European enemies and deciding we need to be people who accept these people, whoever they are. There's that sense of we're moving towards anti-Semitism, but we don't really know what they're about. And added to that, there was a lot of ignorance about, is Judaism still what it was in the Hebrew Bible? Many educated non-Jewish Americans had these questions. Do you still sacrifice? Is the Jewish religion what I know from my religious upbringing in Christianity? So there were multiple audiences, and among Jews, there was a sense, especially among the rabbis, that many Jews had become alienated from Jewish religion and really didn't know what it meant to live a Jewishly religious or observant life.
Well, we have a lot of questions here, and you're going to have to keep your answers as concise as possible if we're going to get through as many of these as we can, but I will see how we do. One person asks that you mentioned the sort of progression from, looking at Jews as a race and this sort of, inferior race or something like that, to this religion moment, and then, you talked about this sort of more culture-based period toward the end of the 20th century. And the question is, where do you see perceptions of Jews and Judaism today?
Yeah, I mean, I do think the post-war moment that Postwar Stories is describing has left a legacy in that American Jews, I think, are more likely to, when asked, describe their Jewishness as a religion, even if they also follow up with, oh, but I'm not very religious, or they still think of Jewishness as a religion. And it may be that I'm not very religious, but there's still that categorization. And it struck me when I met Jews not from the US, I mean, especially from Europe and of course from the former Soviet Union, they are so not used to thinking of Judaism that way. And actually, even in Canada, where Judaism didn't have that same tri-faith moment in the immediate post-war moment, we didn't have this Protestant Catholic Jew moment in Canada the way we have in the U.S. So I think
I'm glad you brought that up, because one of the questions is about if this is unique to the United States. Yeah.
Yeah. So I think a lot of it is pretty distinctive. Post-World War II, we don't have the same Judeo-Christian moment where that idea, which is kind of this reinvention of what America is about, which is really popular here starting in the 1930s and during World War II as a way to unite Americans. Other countries aren't experiencing that, and they're not experiencing the Will Herberg Protestant Catholic Jew 50s era, when it was considered these three major religions for this country.
And well, someone asked, what are the implications of Judaism or Jewish identity becoming a religion, and specifically an American religion? And I guess we could read that question a few ways. And what I'm curious about is are there what's gained and what's lost? I guess would be one way of framing that by Jews choosing in one way or another to be an American religion. Yeah,
I mean, the ethnic part, I guess, is what we wonder, since so many Jews experience all these non-religion-y parts. What's interesting to me is that the ethnic part of Jewishness does not disappear in the 50s. I think part of that is it's also the era of the great Jewish comedians, and they're doing something to keep ethnic Jewishness alive. But I think it's also because of the Holocaust, even say the reform movement that had always been concentrated on Judaism as a religion becomes a little bit more accepting of ethnic Jewishness, that, they do become a bit more traditional in the 40s. Today we see this too. They have a little more Hebrew, a little more singing. They're more integrating. I guess what I mean there is after the Holocaust, it is not as acceptable to sound so intolerant of Yiddishkeit in a way that I think Reform Judaism had often come off that way. In the 19th century and early 20th century, they were so concerned to keep up with the decorum of Protestantism.
Yes. Well, I guess that goes to the question about becoming specifically an American religion, right? Which is maybe following this Protestant model, has maybe more to do with belief, or there's some building you go to once a week,
right?
Something like that, rather than other practices and things, that other ways of framing what that means.
Yeah, I mean, in the 50s, there is this moment of, now that we are really focused on the religion, is that supposed to mean exactly what the Protestants do when they talk about faith and belief? Because that's never been the full way we Jews have talked about religion. I guess what is surprising and interesting is that through the 50s, you do see Jews pushing back and sort of not trying to match up exactly to the Protestant model of what religion is. And we see that in Jewish summer camps in the 50s, and youth groups, and just sort of all of the, organizational life around Judaism, like Hadassah, like all sorts of Jewish groups, I'm thinking, that were active in the 50s and that were not solely focused on religion. So the religion, it is a new sort of centerpiece of Judaism. It needs to be in a way during the Cold War, but I don't think all the other parts are lost.
Yeah. A couple people asked about Philip Roth's role in this. Obviously you're focusing on this middlebrow. I guess maybe his work is counted more as highbrow, although, one person asked about Goodbye Columbus and Portnoy's Complaint, which, probably became more popular works and waste Goodbye Columbus became a film too.
Yeah, I mean, so I think in my period, Philip Roth's first book is in 1959, Goodbye Columbus.
Right, so that's
that
the end
is
of
kind of in this era. What's interesting to me in that book is one of the short stories, I think it was Eli the Fanatic,
yes,
which takes place in the suburbs and where there are, I guess, sort of Hasidic refugees who are building a yeshiva, and they're walking around the progressive suburb and with beards and the long coats. And that is a trope that actually I see a lot in the late 50s. Herman Wouk, the same year in 1959, This Is My God, he has a scene where his modern Jew is walking down the streets of Manhattan and comes across two survivors who are Hasidic and are wearing the black hat and the black coat, and it's the same feelings that Roth is describing, the feelings of, I'm embarrassed about the image that you're presenting to the world of us Jews, and then I feel also feeling bad about how you look because you were clearly a survivor. And so that experience about those Jews who are very visibly religious is one that it's interesting to see both Roth and Wouk look at that in the late 50s.
Yeah, and like with the and critically in a way, right?
Yeah.
It's interesting. It's like their expression of those anxieties is kind of what the middlebrow material is trying to assuage, right? By being like, look, here's basic Judaism.
Right.
Look, we have this like sensible religion that's like about, free will. And right, it's sort of trying to paint this as sort of something like we can all get behind or something. And, and the question that a different person asked about, Portnoy's complaint, which is well past your period, right? I think it's 69 or something. Yeah. Where it's, a lot of, view of Jews as sexually liberal would be the nice way to put it.
Right.
But that's the question is about how those sorts of attitudes that were not so middlebrow played into this middlebrow moment, like is that what made those kinds of writers, or I don't know, even somebody like Norman Mailer into like, oh, you're this bad boy, because there already was this sort of establishment Jewish position on where we're going to be in American life.
Yeah, I mean, I do think in a way the middlebrow moment sets the scene for that to happen later. And at the end, my last chapter, or the conclusion of the book, is about that after moment that, Jews would never need to be introduced in quite the same way after this mid-century moment. And it gave these highbrow authors something to push back against, to ridicule, to move beyond. And so the glory of American Jewish literature is not the middlebrow writers, but this group that came after. But I think this group kind of paved the way for them.
And, you obviously, this book just came out, but you wrote this over a course of a number of years researching and writing it. One person asks, if you were writing this, if you were starting this project now, how would you do it? What would be different? And, I'm going to, since that's toward the end of our time, I'm going to tack onto that question my own question, which is like, and this is me asking as a novelist who sort of has been, kind of accidentally thrust into this sort of middlebrow space about anti-Semitism. Is there a way that like someone could write like a gentleman's agreement today in response or as a way of confronting the sort of this cyclical moment of anti-Semitism that we maybe find ourselves in today? So that's me tacking on to the reader's question, which was about how would you do this if you were starting this project now? What would be different? Given where we are now in American Jewish life.
Right. I mean, there'd probably be more with anti-Semitism. I mean, I'm struck by your own question about could we do a novel about anti-Semitism today, just because I do. I assign this to my students often. I often teach Gentleman's Agreement, and they are asked to do a reboot or remake of Gentleman's Agreement. And would Jews be the group discriminated against? It doesn't have to be Jews. How would this novel or story play out? And of course, I mean, today they mostly think it could happen on a college campus. because that is sort of the site that they are used to thinking about.
I mean, they live there.
Yeah, they live there.
But it is at the center of a lot of conversations now about American anti-Semitism. Yeah.
Right. So I do think, if it were being done today, I do think a college campus would probably be more central, because that's the space that a lot of us are reading about this happening.
And in terms of if you were to write this starting now?
Yeah. You mean do like sort of the same era, but
if you were like looking back at this era now, I mean, there's something interesting and kind of, to me, almost a little bit inspirational reading this now. And I'm not, looking at it as a historian the way you are, but sort of looking at this and seeing that this was a moment when this community was facing a lot of external pressure and sort of, kind of marshaled a lot of creativity in confronting it. And I'm sort of curious how you see that.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I've wondered about that too. What kind of novels will come out of this moment of young people who've experienced anti-Semitism? What kind of plays and fiction? And so, I mean, I guess I think I would do it somewhat similarly in that here I am also interested in what were the personal experiences of the writers. And so for many of the anti-Semitism novels, it was what experiences had they gone through that made them sensitive to anti-Semitism or to writing about Judaism. And I think that would still be where my interest would be today. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for sharing this with us.
Really
and thank you for bringing back to life all these amazing figures who really created the world we now live in. So thank you.